We gather here today as those who stand on yet another border between summer's warmth and leisure and autumn's crisp reminder of work to do and new responsibilities to shoulder. Continue to travel with us, we pray, as we encounter novel tasks, unfamiliar ideas, new friends, some successes, and some disappointments. We pray especially today for those millions of our fellow human beings who are crossing new frontiers all over the world, driven from home by destitution and oppression, hunger, and murderous danger. In their weariness, bear them up. In their despair, give them hope. And for those of us who can still remain at home, at least for now, touch our hearts with compassion and a commitment to justice for those who wander in strange lands. We pray in the name of the one whose prophets remind us to remember the strangers in our midst, for we were once and could again be strangers ourselves. Amen.
Good afternoon. I want to welcome you all today to the 191st Annual Convocation of the Harvard Divinity School. We gather here today with the promise of a new and exciting academic year, but we also gather under the shadows of conflicts and contestations around the world in which we live. Conflicts and contestations that are redolent on all sides and in all communities, with language of intemperate and extreme religious ideas and feelings rather than language of religious tolerance, thoughtfulness, social concern, moral conscience, peaceful intent, or even simple humility. This challenges all of us who as scholars concern ourselves with the history, thought, and action of diverse religious traditions around the world, and especially those of us who do so in an institution such as HDS with its long heritage of liberal religion. As we celebrate today the beginning of a new year of common study, colloquy, of pedagogy, and of learning, let us contemplate our responsibilities to this community and to the wider world to help bring greater understanding of religious traditions and issues in a time of international and national crises in which religion and morality are constantly but all too seldom intelligently invoked. As a first step today, we begin an ongoing focus ourselves on and rededication to the consideration of issues of diversity in the coming years of life at HDS. And we begin this with our faculty address by Davíd Carrasco, our colleague. I know you will join me in the hope that this will be but the beginning of increased attention to these and other critical issues for any adequate study of religion in the 21st century. Welcome to each and every one who joins us today. I remind you that at the conclusion of the convocation today, we welcome everyone to join us back on the front lawn of the Divinity School under the tent for a reception to begin the new year. And now let me welcome Evelyn Hammond, who will bring greetings on behalf of the university. Evelyn is our senior vice provost and a person whom I have worked with and have only the utmost respect for, an historian of science herself. She has brought new, I think, excitement and energy to some of the most pressing issues for us, precisely issues of diversity in our university. And it's a great honor to have her here to bring greetings today. Evelyn.
It is truly wonderful to be here as part of this opening convocation of the Harvard Divinity School, and what a glorious day you have for this gathering. I bring you greetings from our interim president, Derek Bach, and Provost Steve Hyman. In my capacity as Senior Vice Provost for Faculty Development and Diversity, I am especially pleased to be a part of this convocation today because this event marks the beginning of your multi-year project to engage in a school-wide dialogue on race, ethnicity, and class, or simply put, diversity. And let me just say a few words about that project. Thinking about and engaging with the multiple meanings and complexities around the notion of diversity is hard work. It is harder than rocket science, as one scholar quipped. In part, it is hard work because the meaning of diversity changes from generation to generation. In his wonderful essay, Diversity and Learning at Harvard, an Historical Overview, former Harvard President Neil Rudenstein noted that in the mid-19th century, diversity at Harvard meant admitting students from different geographical regions in the hopes that bringing students together from around the country would help to remove long-held prejudices about regional differences. And between 1850 and 1909, Rudenstein writes, and I quote, "The definition of diversity steadily expanded throughout this period. The early emphasis was primarily on diversity of ideas or points of view. But the most perceptive thinkers soon realized that those curious things that we call ideas are not disembodied phenomena or abstractions. They are complicated bundles of perceptions, intuitions, arguments, opinions, dispositions, convictions, feelings, attitudes, and rhetorical gestures that cohere and also shift, mutate, and sometimes fail to cohere in live human beings who constantly express, modify, reconsider, and reformulate what it is they think and feel, or what they think it is they think and feel." In the 20th century, the meaning of diversity at Harvard continued to change as the world changed. The Divinity School is, of course, already diverse, as your website notes, with your students and faculty representing over 55 denominations and strikingly diverse ethnic, cultural, and religious backgrounds. You have a unique opportunity in this moment, early in the 21st century, to articulate a new conception of the value of diversity in teaching, scholarship, and community in your own school and in this university. Your greatest challenge, in my view, will be to address the perception that many have of a tension between diversity and excellence. The Divinity School has already faced this challenge in one part through its recruitment of outstanding women faculty and through its highly regarded Women's Studies program in religion. Yet, there is much to do on this point with respect to race and ethnicity here and throughout the university. One of the greatest challenges I've had since taking on this new post is trying to dismantle the notion that there is an inherent tension between diversity and excellence. Rather, I've argued, as have others, that diversity is an essential component or condition of excellence in the 21st century. As you begin your dialogue this year, you might begin by exploring how the word diversity came into common usage as a synonym for other terms that connote difference, as a code for the other, with the sometimes not so subtle subtext assuming that those others would somehow lower standards of scholarship. Rather, what would it look like to fully value and engage the differing perspectives each of us has had in building a community rich in intellectual excellence and moral leadership? Of course, diversity was not always the word we used to talk about when we talked of building heterogeneous and harmonious communities of scholarship and learning. When I was growing up in Atlanta, Georgia, during the height of the civil rights movement, no one used the word diversity. We used words like justice and equity. And perhaps we should return to those words as we seek new ways to express a commitment to diversity and to excellence. We need your leadership in this work, and I look forward to being a part of the conversation. Thank you.
first reading is written in Professor Leila Ahmed's memoir entitled A Border Passage. All these kinds of issues inhering in my situation and in what I was living through as I pursued my work and life as a graduate student, we would eventually identify, address, explore, and analyze as my own generation and the generation just ahead of my own began to mature as academics and intellectuals. For what I was living and passively learning was exactly the kind of experience that would fuel the intellectual revolution that would come, particularly in the American academic world, as those from the margins, blacks, women, people from other cultures and minority cultures in the West, understood their exclusion from the academic curriculum and set to work to make their own perspectives and histories academically visible. And thus they began to rework old theories and devise new ones, grounded in the lives and histories of their own people, and to make sense of the processes and currents of history and society from the perspective of their own, our own lives. For the truth is, I think, that we are always plural. Not either this or that, but this and that. And we always embody in our multiple shifting consciousnesses a convergence of traditions, cultures, histories coming together in this time and in this place and moving like rivers through us. And I know now that the point is to look back with insight and without judgment. And I know now that it is of the nature of being in this place of convergence, of histories, cultures, ways of thought, that there will always be new ways to understand what we are living through, and that I will never come to a point of rest or of finality in my understanding. Here ends the first reading.
Buenas tardes. The second reading is an English translation of the 1649 Nahuatl text known as the Way Tlamahuicolteca, by a great miracle, which recounts the apparitions in 1530 of La Virgen de Guadalupe to the Aztec commoner Juan Diego, Cuauhtlatoa, he who speaks as an eagle. One Nahuatl Latin-Spanish passage from the original is included in my reading, which illustrates how the text used bilingual names for God and gods drawn from European and indigenous languages to describe the meaning which the Virgin Mary came to have in colonial Mexico. Thereupon she conversed with Juan Diego, revealing to him her precious wish. And she said to him, "Know, rest assured, my youngest child, that I am Santa Maria, in Ninatzin, in Well, Nelly Teotol Dios, in Ipalnemowani, in Tecoyoyani, in Tloquenahuaque, the eternally consummate Virgin Saint Mary, Mother of the very true deity God, the giver of life, the creator of people, the ever-present, the Lord of heaven and earth. I greatly wish and desire that they build my temple for me here, where I will manifest, make known, and give to people all my love, compassion, aid, and protection. For I am the compassionate mother of you, and of all you people here in this land, and of the other various people who love me, who cry out to me, who seek me, who trust in me. There I will listen to their weeping and their sorrows in order to remedy and heal all their various afflictions, miseries, and torments. And in order that this my act of compassion, which I am contemplating, may come to pass, go to the bishop's palace in Mexico and tell him how I am sending you to put before him how I very much wish that he build me a house, that he erect a temple for me on the level ground here. Here ends the second reading.
Dean Graham, Vice Provost Hammonds, Reverends Cox and Austin, members of the Faculty of Divinity, special guests, students, and friends of the Divinity School. My name is Kimberly Patton, and I'm honored to introduce today as our convocation speaker for this new academic year, Professor Davíd Carrasco, Neil L. Rudenstine Professor of the Study of Latin America. Professor Carrasco, who is a specialist in Mesoamerican religions and in theoretical approaches to religion, came to Harvard from Princeton University in 2001. He holds a joint appointment in the Divinity School and in the Anthropology Department in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. He received his doctorate from the University of Chicago under the guidance of 4 giants in our field: Mircea Eliade, Charles Long, Jonathan Z. Smith, and Paul Wheatley. His dissertation on myths and prophecies of the Aztec feathered serpent Quetzalcoatl resulted in a seminal work, Quetzalcoatl and the Irony of Empire, published by the University of Chicago Press in 1982. This book inaugurated a cascade of important works in ancient Mesoamerican traditions over the decades to follow, such as his City of Sacrifice, the Aztec Empire and the Role of Violence in Civilization, his Religions of Mesoamerica, Cosmovision and Ceremonial Centers, and, with Eduardo Matos Moctezuma and Johanna Broda, the Great Temple of Tenochtitlan, Center and Periphery in the Aztec World. Together with Professor William Fash, who joins us today, he is also the co-editor of the award-winning Oxford Encyclopedia of Mesoamerican Cultures. Professor Carrasco's work in antiquities has expressed itself through numerous collaborative scholarly projects, including the Moses Mesoamerican Archive at the University of Colorado, where he taught before coming to Princeton, an archive which gathers together the evidence for the temple at Tenochtitlan. Over his career, he has organized a series of important and generative conferences at Mexico City, Colorado, Princeton, and Harvard, which continue to generate conversations and publications. He is pivotal in the recent international joint scholarly project on the translation and significance of the 16th century Chichimec Mapa de Cuautinchan. His own work reveals particular foci on the symbolism of the city and its relationship to periphery, in cosmology, in archaeoastronomy, on the exegesis of ritual, particularly sacrifice and burial. Carrasco offers an integrative theorization of human religious experience, one that through multiple lenses and uses of evidence allows the alienated postmodern mind to re-enter ancient worldviews, and to do so with respect and resonance. I would add that in addition to respect and resonance, he brings to his work qualities rare among scholars, namely humanity and humor. My first introduction to Professor Carrasco's work, for example, was his 1995 History of Religions article on ritual flaying and the ideology of war called Give Me Some Skin, the Charisma of the Aztec Warrior. With roots in the Copper Canyon of Chihuahua, Mexico, Davíd Carrasco has promoted not only collaborative and multidisciplinary approaches to the study of ancient Mesoamerica, he has also championed the authority and primacy of scholars of Mexican heritage in the study and analysis of Mexican antiquities. But for Davíd Carrasco, the world does not end with the Templo Mayor. What further distinguishes him is his equally powerful intellectual and political commitment to religious dimensions of current Latino experience, including the centrality of devotion to the Virgin of Guadalupe, to the myth of Aztlán, and his work on issues of transculturation. He co-produced the film Alambrista, the director's cut, which is on Mexican farm workers in the U.S., and he edited the recent collection Alambrista and the U.S.-Mexico Border, Film, Music, and Stories of Undocumented Immigrants, published by the University of New Mexico Press. He remains passionate about social justice in every culture and the spiritual experience of the dispossessed at borders of every kind. In December of 2004, he was awarded the Order of the Aztec Eagle by the Mexican government, the highest decoration awarded a foreign national. In that ceremony, the U.S. ambassador to Mexico, Carlos de Izaca, called Davíd Carrasco a man of our time, a man of enormous vitality and value. Today he will offer us a talk entitled Borderlands and the Biblical Hurricane, Images and Stories of Latin American Rhythms of Life. Professor Carrasco, welcome and thank you.
It's not easy to speak after this wonderful music, these powerful readings, and this introduction. But having studied the Aztec tradition for some years, I know that when people introduce someone like that and raise them up to a very high level, that it's often in preparation for sacrificing them, which always keeps one very humble in the process. Vice Provost Hammond, Dean Graham, esteemed colleagues, honored guests, graduates, and especially new students, thank you all for this honor of presenting the Convocation Address of 2006. At this moment of beginning, I remember one of my own in the life of my grandmother, Carlota Carranza. Born at the end of the 19th century in Bato Pilas, Mexico, in a silver mining town at the bottom of the Copper Canyon, migrated to El Paso, Texas, on the U.S.-Mexico border during the Mexican Revolution, and helping to raise me, infused in me a sense of religiosity and the struggle of border crossing into my own life. She was known for having very beautiful skin, especially on her face, and as an elderly woman, she drew many compliments. When we grandchildren asked her in her old age how she managed to keep her skin so fresh and beautiful, she replied, "I have a concoction of secret ingredients." Fascinated, we asked her to tell us. Smiling, she said, "The secret ingredients are prayer, 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 and good cosmetics." In preparing for this talk, I read many of the previous convocation speeches and especially benefited from the last three. Janet Gyatso's Where We Stand Now, Reverend Peter Gomes' Backward Glance and Forward Look, and Ann Browdy's 50 Years of Women at Harvard Divinity School. I encourage especially the new students to read these. Often they get spoken, published, and nobody reads them. You must read these. These will give you a chance to understand the development and trajectory of this school, of which you've now joined and will help us renew. Today is a double beginning. It's the beginning of the academic year, but it's also the beginning of what my colleague Hammond said, we may prove to be a serious long-term commitment to reorient our thinking and some resources to more widely and deeply diversify and renew our curriculum, faculty, and thinking. A symbol of the issue and the challenge may be reflected in the fact, and Reverend Gomes just confirmed this for me, that after initial research, it appears that I'm the first Spanish surname professor with real roots and experience in Latin American borderlands in the history of our school. Now, does that say something about our school? Or does that say something about Latin America? In fact, as I look around the school and indeed our university, I'm troubled by the often temporary and restricted representation of Latin American, Latinos, Chicano scholars on our various faculties and African Americans on our own. Could it be that our beloved school is more a borderline that hinders the enlargement of our vision of religion and difference than a borderland where we share intellectual excellence of many ethnic and racial shades? We can't always depend on the Women's Studies and Religion program to be bringing in these wonderful talents for a year and then they go away. We will advance our cause for excellence and diversity by paying attention to the energy, thought, and life rhythms expressed by the writers, storytellers, artists, thinkers, scholars, and theologians of Latin America. Consider the long list of Nobel Prize winners in literature given to Latin American writers just between 1947 and 1992. In less than 50 years, Gabriela Mistral from Chile, Miguel Ángel Asturias from Guatemala, whose Men of Maíz illuminated indigenous interactions with Euro-American cultures in Guatemala, Pablo Neruda from Chile, whose Canto General is considered one of the greatest epic poems written in any language, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, William Kennedy, who wrote a review of Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude in the New York Times, said, 100 Years of Solitude is the first piece of literature since the book of Genesis that should be required reading for the entire human race. It takes up not long after Genesis left off and carries us through the air age. Now, I can think, as you can, of numerous other writings we should all be required to read. but you get the point. Octavio Paz won the Nobel Prize from Mexico in 1990, and Derek Walcott in 1992, whose residence is listed, by the way, as Trinidad and Boston. Yes, the Caribe is also Latin America, not to mention Carlos Fuentes, Isabel Allende, Borges, José Martí, and Nélida Piñón. I mention these names and prizes for two reasons. First of all, to emphasize the combination of narrative genius and cultural diversities within Latin America. For cultures, languages, and religious practices are very different in Chile from what they are in Guatemala, remarkably different in Colombia from what they are in Mexico and Brazil. My second point in invoking these Nobel Prize winners is that the crux of their achievements was the creation of new narrative languages written from within the various borderlands and border crossings of Europe, Africa, indigenous and Asian cultures that make up Latin America. These writings from the Americas resulted, in the words of one historian, in things new and different from anything else in the world. And what Octavio Paz says in his Nobel Prize lecture about transplanted European languages can, I believe, be said about transplanted European, African, and even Asian religions in Latin America. Octavio Paz wrote, "The European languages were planted in an unknown and unnamed world of the Americas. They took root in the new lands, and as they grew, they were transformed. They are the same plant, and yet also a different plant. Latin American languages and literatures very soon cease to be mere transatlantic reflections. At times they have been the negation of the literatures of Europe. More often, they have been a reply." I tried to communicate the urgency for us to see and listen and undergo Latin American and Latino images in the title of my talk. Allow me to remark on this series of words: borderlands, biblical, and hurricanes, and show you a series of arresting images to illustrate my main points and these rhythms of life. There's my man. To illustrate my main points about these rhythms of life. Rhythms of life of race mixture, not just race discourse, but race mixture discourse. Asymmetrical hybridity, not just hybridity, but asymmetrical hybridity. And being in two places at once. First of all, borderlands. The image that you see here is a playbill for a drama called Boxcar, about Mexican undocumented workers who died in a boxcar abandoned in the desert. Take a look at it and give me, in your own mind, your own sort of thoughts about it. What you see here on the right is a man who's looking through the slats of a boxcar. But that slat becomes the Rio Bravo, the Rio Grande itself. In the middle you see the same man, only now realizing he's trapped in his process of coming across the border. And then you see his destiny on the left. He becomes dead. He's death. This is the fate of many people who do border crossings. And I show this image to have you think a little bit with me about the borderlands. When I was a child, we considered the borderlands that space from Chihuahua to Las Cruces, New Mexico, west to Los Angeles, and southeast to Brownsville. An area which Carlos Vélez Ibáñez says is filled with unequal distribution of sadness. Distribution of sadness filling the lives of Mexican people. This was also an area of intense and long-term exchange between Mexicans and U.S. culture. It was in this area, in the 19th century, early in this century, in the 18th century, where musics mixed, cuisines developed, bilingualism and intermarriage developed distinctive cultural combinations in this area. But this area was also the funnel for over 1/10 of the Mexican population that came to the United States during the Mexican Revolution. This area was the funnel for the Bracero program, which brought thousands and thousands of Mexican workers into the United States. But my point about this funnel is, and it's very important to remember this during all this immigration stuff, is that alliances were always set up between institutions in this country and people in this country and institutions in Mexico to bring these workers over. They didn't just come running across the border. They were recruited in Mexico. They were set up with railroads and farming communities here. What I'm trying to say is that there was a common cultural, political, labor culture that was developed in this area. long before we have this present immigration debate. So this Borderlands, when I was growing up, was an area that now social scientists reveal was filled with alliances between workers, railroad companies, farmers, from Brownsville to Michigan. People, Mexican Americans, and people who worked with them lived with a combination of illegality on the one hand and opportunity on the other. Opportunities that were opportunities for people on both sides of the border. When these workers come across the border, they're not just benefiting the Mexican workers, they're benefiting the people on this side of the border here. And it's always been that way. And so when I talk about Borderlands, I want to first of all, in a sense, invoke this kind of idea. Borderlands has expanded. Now we look at Los Angeles itself as a huge Borderlands. You know the Puerto Rican joke. The Puerto Rican joke is, the best thing about New York City is that it's so close to the United States. Today it's said that the U.S. Latin American borderland stretches from Guatemala, no, Chile, to Wisconsin. And people come across certainly for economic motives, but it's also very interesting to remember, as John Coatsworth of our own university has revealed in his own research, that many people are coming here because we were there. John Coatsworth shows that 42 times in the 20th century, the United States government was involved in regime change in Latin America. 42 times. The United States was crossing that border involved in regime change in Latin America. So why are these people coming here? Because we were there. It's not just because of economic abilities and economic opportunities. They learned about us through this type of interventions that were often done without the will of local people. You know we're in a new cultural situation of the Borderlands when over 40% of the all-star players were from Spanish-speaking countries. Or when you take your children to go see Shrek 2, and it ends with that green ogre and his pals doing a salsa to Living La Vida Loca. Or you find Harvard students dancing as they have to my favorite Latino band, Dr. Loco's Rocking Jalapeno Band. So it can be said we're all now living in the Borderlands, as Harvey Cox's Invocation suggested. Latin American and Latino writers are telling us in various ways that the Borderlands is not so much a place to write about as a place to think and write from. Leila Ahmed, along with a powerful wave of anthropologists, feminists, and historians, are illuminating in many other parts of the world the anguish and productivity of border passages between countries, between cultures, between religions, between genders, and especially identity. They know that the borderlands of race mixture, the borderlands of religious hybridity and personal identity, of living in two or more places at once, is where many of us are living now and have been living in part all our lives, even if we're taught to pretend otherwise. The signal achievement of a borderlands perspective is found in the work of Gloria Anzaldua's La Frontera / Borderlands, the new mestiza. Anzaldua's great contribution is to create a space in between from where to think, rather than a hybrid space to talk about. A hybrid thinking space of Spanish, Latin American, and Amerindian legacies as the condition for a possibility of Spanish, Latin American, and Amerindian post-colonial theories. Her achievement, rooted in what she calls the 6 dialects of Spanish she listened to and learned on the U.S.-Mexico border, anticipated Frederick Cooper's response to the question, can the subaltern speak? With the question I'm asking us with my emphasis on stories and images, and which Michael Jackson is asking in his many books, can the theorist listen? Can the theorist listen to something besides other theories? This in-between space is represented here in this image of La Malinche. Some of you don't know who La Malinche is. The story of La Malinche is that when Hernan Cortez first came ashore with the Spaniards in 1519 on his expedition, one of the first words he heard was the word Castile, and he realized that there must be other Spaniards who were shipwrecked inland. It was true. He found 2 Spaniards who had been shipwrecked 10 years before and who had become Maya Indian peoples. He found one of them, one is named Aguilar, and Aguilar came back and joined the Spaniards. He now spoke Maya and Spanish. But this was still a problem for Cortez because when they got into the edge of the Aztec Empire, he had nobody among his group who could speak the language of the Aztec Empire. But then he met this startling young woman named Doña, whose name was Malinali, became Malinche. Now, she was already bilingual and bicultural herself because she grew up in an Aztec community, but as a child was given to a Maya family, so she spoke Aztec and Maya. And so now you had the linguistic link. Cortez spoke to Aguilar in Spanish, he spoke to Doña Marina in Maya, and she spoke to Moctezuma in Nahuatl. She became the bridge of this remarkable linguistic achievement and this conquest of Mexico. And she has become known as Doña Marina or Malinche. She became so important in the Aztec, in the Spanish conquest of Mexico, that the Spaniards themselves and the Aztecs, partly out of respect and partly to make fun of him, called Cortez Malinche, because she became his tongue, his communicator. And here you see her standing in between the Spaniards on one side and the Aztecs on the other. She also became his mistress, and she had symbolically the first mestizo. But there you see her large, in the middle, as though language is flowing back and forth between her. She becomes this very important space in between from which to think and speak. Harvard has had its own border crossers into Latin America, but most of you will be surprised by this picture of one of the heroes of the Divinity School. I think Ron Thiemann and perhaps his colleagues will be the only ones who will know that this is William James. During his transformative sojourn to Brazil in 1895 and 1896. It appears in a hot off-the-press book published by the David Rockefeller Center here at Harvard, entitled Brazil Through the Eyes of William James, Letters, Diaries, and Drawings. And in this book, in his diaries, James wrote, I said to myself, before I came away, WJ, in this excursion to Brazil, you'll learn to know yourself and your resources somewhat more intimately than you do now, and will come back with your character considerably changed. Of course, he went temporarily blind when he got there from smallpox, and here you see him actually recovering, and I just thought this was a very good moment for Harvard people to see previous Harvard border crossers, the great author of Varieties of Religious Experience, although we'd have to look back at that book now and see what he tells us about Brazilian religions. He looks very much like a dude here to me. He said he had to protect himself against swarms of tropical insects at night. He wrote, they began to, quote, sing like the great organ of Boston. The second term is biblical, but in lower case and in quotes from my title. It's from the last page of Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude. This is to emphasize the reinterpretations, negotiations, and sometimes profound changes biblical image and stories of saints underwent in the hands of Africans, Native Americans, and mixed-race peoples, and transplanted Europeans in the New World. It's the same Bible and story of a saint, and a different Bible and story of a saint. A strong way of saying this is that Christianity was, when it came to the New World, a double entendre. Maybe hard for us to hear this in the Divinity School, but on the one hand, Christianity was a rough and elegant instrument in the oppressive practices of colonialism and genocide. While on the other hand, it came to be in league with its victims. One way to understand the fate and challenge of people caught in this double entendre, on the one hand receiving some of the beautiful, remarkable stories of Christianity with its blessing and its masses and the magic of the Mass, but on the other hand, undergoing the terrible oppression of these Spanish and Portuguese institutions, and then themselves having to make something out of this so that they would be both Christian and themselves. One way to understand this is to look at the work of Mary Louise Pratt in her book Imperial Eyes. She calls this meeting a contact zone. A contact zone is a space of colonial encounters, the space in which peoples geographically and historically separated come into contact with each other and establish ongoing relations, usually involving conditions of coercion, radical inequality, and intractable conflict, often within radically asymmetrical relationships of power. By emphasizing for us the notion of contact, I'm foregrounding the interaction, improvisational dimensions of colonial encounters, so easily ignored or suppressed by diffusionist accounts. In these situations, what people had to do on all sides, not only the indigenous and the Africans, they had to pick and choose from those things that were coming into their community, but also picking and choosing from things that they had in their community already. This is called the work of transculturation, something developed remarkably by anthropologists. Certainly there was assimilation. Certainly there was acculturation, but there was also transculturation. See how much that word trans shows up when you look at Latin America. Transculturation, where you pick and choose from things that come in, and you pick and choose from things that were already in your community. Sometimes you disguise them, but you're always putting together these combinations, and you have some agency to do that, even though you're under this terrible oppressive structure. One vivid example of this double entendre is in the ways Native Americans in Mexico reinterpreted the powers of the Catholic saint Santiago, who stood most clearly for the violence done to Native Americans by Spaniards in the conquest period. Santiago arrived from Spain as the symbol of the Reconquista, Christianity on the move, the holy war against Islam in Iberia. Here we see the typical image of the saint on his white horse, about to crush the cowering Muslim with their swords. Indians who came to replace the Muslims in these images, even after suffering terrible oppression by the bringers of Santiago, took him as their own. As over 81 colonial towns took him as their patron saint, and many prominent Indian men took Santiago as their surname. They came to see in his powers something they could benefit from and still remain native in their identity. His powers became the power of protection of their own communities against enemies, sometimes even the Spanish Christians. Picking and choosing from what they heard about him and experienced, and from their own understanding of sacred animals, they were particularly attracted by his horse, who they saw as a new example of an immensely powerful zoological world of pre-Hispanic America with its jaguars and eagles and serpents. The horse became, in Indian stories and images, a sign of mystical military power coming from outside the human realm that could protect the Indians. And women often offered corn to the image of the horse to help them in childbirth. The third word in my title is hurricane. The word hurricane comes from the Taino-Caribbean word huracan, who was the god of the storms of powerful changes. In my usage, it points to African, indigenous, European foundations of Latin America, perhaps all of the Americas' life rhythms. For many hurricanes are born off the coast of Africa and move into the worlds of Latin America, where its indigenous people survived them and imagined these storms as divine beings. Then these mighty storms of cosmic proportions move into what we now call North America. You see the Africanist presence and change in this group portrait painted at the end of the 16th century, entitled The Three Mulatto Gentlemen from Esmeraldas, Ecuador. It signals racial transformation, the physical borderlands, but also the borderlands in their clothes. Because what these men are dressed in, there's an Indian poncho made of European clothes, covering an European shirt, but wearing jewelry from the Inca traditions. One of the gifts from Latin American cultural history and discourse is its challenge to us to move our discussion on race to studies and interpretations of race mixtures, mestizaje, mulatez, creolizations. I think some of us know that Arnold Schwarzenegger recently got in some trouble about this when he talked about how he thought people of black and Latino blood were just too hot and couldn't be dealt with. Well, he's feeling very uncomfortable with his race mixtures. Racial and cultural mixing characterized Latin America from its beginnings. When Europeans, Africans, and Native Americans met, struggled, coerced, dominated, and fell in love, mated, creating societies very different from what the conquistadors and missionaries envisioned in Spain. The many mixtures challenged the Spanish binary of República de los Españoles and República de los Indios. And when the mestizos and mulattos experienced their own demographic explosion, they formed groups called castas, and this raised havoc in conditions of citizenship and social legitimacy throughout these areas. This photograph of three sisters from the same family, reflects what ethnographers have shown to us, that all these players in the contact zone, not just the whiter ones, learned how to manipulate and adjust their identities for social protest and social protection of themselves and their children. One example of transculturation is found in the Cristo de Caña, these hollow papier-mâché-like images of Christ on the cross, made of plants and produced in Mexico by Indians during the colonial period. This Cristo de Caña was displayed in the 1992 exhibit, Mexico's Splendor of 30 Centuries, which illustrated the combination of artistry and violence in the life-size figure of the crucified Jesus. These Christs were made of corn stalks and corn pitch, orchid bulb glue, carpenter's paste, and a fine stucco clay surface wrapped around a wooden frame, made by Indians, indicating that their Christianity was outwardly well-formed to a European eye. But a closer look at an accidental discovery of what was inside reveals that these were objects of the contact zone. William Taylor, in his masterful study, writes, "These light crucifixes from the early colonial period, whose materials connected Christ's passage through birth, death, and resurrection to the regeneration of the sacred food plant, maíz, sometimes contained writing that would have added to the figure's sacred energy, at least for the maker. In the case of the Cristo de Caña from Indian Mexicalcingo, an Indian pueblo in the Valley of Mexico, improvisation as well as conversion was at work. It was Antonio Carrillo y Garial, while studying Cristos de Caña, discovered what was inside when one of them fell from a wall and broke open. An examination was made, and it was discovered that in the chest cavity, abdomen and upper arms were formed around pages of Nahuatl text in Roman script concerned with the life of Christ, 16th century community tax records in native style, to which was added a stencil, perhaps an embroidery pattern, of Raphael's painting Il Pasmo de Sicilia, depicting Christ's fall on the road to Calvary. So what they found wrapped up in Jesus' chest here were these documents. First of all, a document written in Nahuatl of the story of the life of Christ. My good colleague Francois Bovon is there asking David, was it the Gospel of Luke? We don't know. Around that was a tax document, but this was a tax document of forced payments that the Indians had to pay to the Spaniards. You see the Spaniards' faces on the left, and these are the objects and the number of things that were forced to pay these Spaniards. This was wrapped around the story of Jesus, and then wrapped around this, you can't see it very well, on the right side, was a stencil copy of this painting of Jesus falling on the road to Calvary. What is the meaning of this contact zone story? The intention is not to insert secret idols behind altars or to illustrate how converted the natives were, but to conceal a secret history, one which narrated that the image of Christ in the contact zone was associated with the Indian community's forced payment to authorities, the suffering of Indians like the falling of Jesus on the road, and bonded to a powerful new means of communication with the sacred through Spanish inscriptions about his life. The next to last set of images I want to show you are perhaps the most fun to look at, and I'd like to especially hear the students from the Divinity School to look at this image and begin to think about what you'd make of this. This is an image of the Cofradia in Santiago, Atitlan, Guatemala, during Holy Week. And I'd like to begin with the figure on the right. You see the figure on the right is a figure known by the Indians as Mashimon, the Lord of Looking Good, they call him. They only bring the Lord of Looking Good out once a year during Holy Week, and they put him into the drama of the Passion of Jesus. Now, when the Maya people would look at these images, they would also look over here at the Jesus on the left, and Maya peoples who tend to see everything in terms of dualities would be very interested in the androgynous appearance of this Jesus figure. Because they come to understand Jesus as a duality as well as their own deities as a duality. And they understand, as they have been taught the Passion story, that the fundamental relationship of the Passion story is in part between Judas and Jesus. But they've also been told all their lives that they are the devil or they are Judas. I mean, the Maya Indians were often told by these priests, you're Judas, you're the betrayer of Jesus because you have not converted. And the Indians, hearing this year after year, looking at this from their own sense of dualism, came to, in a sense, say, but you know, Judas is very important in the story. He's really the brother of Jesus. So if you want to make us Judas, well, we'll be Judas, because we know that your Easter takes place at the same time as our transformation to springtime. And therefore, we as Judas play a very positive role, we come to say. Mashimon on the right happens to be one of the fertility gods of the indigenous people. And because of his own power of fertility, he caused havoc by stimulating sexual relations throughout the community. The gods said, we can't have this, so they invited him to a party. They grabbed him, and they broke his neck, and they turned it around so he'd always face backward. And what you're looking at on the right is really the back of his head with a mask on it, because he's a duality, and he's also androgynous. What happens during Holy Week is that Jesus and Judas in this figure come to be a very dynamic relationship, but the indigenous people come to say Jesus' fate depends upon his brother Judas. And if you're going to make us that, we will play this very important role and we will accept it. I think Karen King here is probably happy to hear that these interpretations are possible even without the benefit of the Gnostic Gospel of Judas, which only came into our awareness just recently. This is Mashimon as the tree at the center of the world during Holy Week, where he is dressed up as the tree. He's got actually animals and fruit under his outfit here. Here he's brought out. What happens is on Maundy Thursday he's brought out and he's taken up to an image of Jesus in the public square and just bows to Jesus as a symbolic betrayal of Jesus. And here he is just before he's brought out to make this symbolic betrayal of Jesus. And then, of course, Jesus goes on to his destiny. But in their view, Judas and Mashimon were absolutely necessary and positive kind of brotherhood. And then at the end here, I just want to show you a remarkable project that we've been involved here at Harvard. The Divinity School has joined with the Department of Anthropology and the Peabody Museum to participate in the interpretation of this national Mexican treasure known as the Mapa or the Codex of Cuauhtinchan. Just 3 years ago, John Coatsworth came to William Fash and I and whispered in our ear that a member of the advisory board of the David Rockefeller Center had told him that she had somehow purchased this rare 16th century map and wanted to know if anyone here at the university would be able to study it. Professor Fash and I said we would study it as long as it remained in Mexico, and so what we did was we made a photographic record of this document, and we organized 15 scholars, anthropologists, ethnobotanists, archaeoastronomers, historians of religions, linguists, who spent the last 3 years examining the Mapa de Cuauhtinchan and coming up with some remarkable discoveries. I can't show you the whole map, but there's one image on the map in particular that I want to take you to. The map itself is a remarkable series of journeys. You can see the footprints. They go to the great city of Cholula in the middle of their journey. They eventually come to their homeland, their place, their home in the world, which is Cuauhtinchan. Throughout this document, they meet deities, they have storms, they fall into the earth, they get in battles, they meet goddesses who save them. There's a whole series of remarkable, and I spent all this time, the last 3 years, studying this document. And I began last summer to kind of have a rapture of the deep experience. You know how it is, my colleagues will tell you, you study something, whether it's literature or theory or William James, and pretty soon you think, well, everything has to do with William James or theory or literature. And I had the same thing happen to me. I started looking at this, and I began to have, as I was preparing for this talk, I began to have these little moments of madness, and I'd say, well, look, I can see Janet Gyatso's Convocation Address referenced here. Here it is. Actually, you know, she gave a talk on Buddhism, but it was out there under the tent. She talked about the tent and the impermanence of the tent. And I looked at this and I said, look, there's Janet under the tent. There she is under the tent. I went a little further in the document in one of these moments of madness, and there's Gomes, a forward and a backward look. You can see these people here on the left, they're having an argument, red-hot words. And you remember, Reverend Gomes had some red-hot words for us a couple of years ago. And then I had this, and then I went a little bit further. I was having this thing, and here you see Anne Browdy, because what happens in the beginning of this, the women are leading the ancestors out of Chicomostoc. Here you see these very powerful women, and I thought, oh, I'm really going crazy now reading this document, because here you see this woman who's coming out of the cave, and she's bringing the sun on her back. She's been shot with these arrows, but she's been very victorious, because you see in her hand she has this leg of a man who they've taken care of. I thought at one point, when I was doing this experience last year of getting this as my Christmas card and sending it to the president of our university to let him know what women can really do, especially in the... But time insists that I really focus on the single image showing a borderland between European and indigenous religiosity. What happens at one point in the document, there's no historical event in this document after the 1450s, but there's one image that is really quite remarkable that represents my theme. And this is the image where the painters are painting an indigenous pre-Columbian temple almost touching the outline of a Christian church. Now, in actual historical life, this could never have taken place because the Spaniards always destroyed the temples before they built the churches. They always destroyed the temples and took the rubble and used them as a base for the church. But these artists, years later, remembering, put together the church and the temple in a kind of contact zone, remembering relationships and historical border crossings in their own private document that never would have been able to stand under Spanish scrutiny in public daily life. I'd like to end with a treat for you by reading just a passage of Garcia Marquez's 100 Years of Solitude. A personal note. I took Toni Morrison to Mexico several years ago, and as we were preparing, she only had one request from me. And I said, well, what is it? She said, well, I want to meet Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And I said, sure. I didn't know Gabriel Garcia Marquez at the time. But I wasn't going to let her get away. So I called up my friend Carlos Fuentes and I said, I think she's going to come. But, she wants to have dinner with Garcia Marquez. He said, there's no problem. He's my best friend. We'll have dinner in my house. And we did. And one of the things that I learned during this evening with Garcia Marquez and Toni Morrison was how profoundly informed he was about literature in the United States and about Toni Morrison's works. He knew the date of every book. He knew the meaning of every book. He knew how she got into these books. It was so clear to me that Garcia Marquez, like so many Latin Americans, know more about us than we know about them. And it not only impressed me, it impressed Morrison. They became good friends. If you ever want to call me a border crosser, I'll always take credit for introducing the two of them. But if he can read us, certainly we should strive to enter the margins and borders of Latin America and Latino images and stories. Here's the last passage in the book. What you're going to be hearing is that a man named Aureliano Babilonia, the last in the family line, like some of you students here, we hope while you're here at Harvard, discovers these parchments. And the parchments have on them, written on them, the history of all the people in this town, written down 100 years ahead of time. Now, Babilonia, who's reading these parchments, reads them as though they're written in Spanish. But they're not. They're written in Sanskrit. And as he's reading them, he realizes he's reading his life up to the very present moment, and that he's never going to leave that room. And here's the passage I wanted to leave you with. It was the history of the family, written by the gypsy Melquiades, down to the most trivial details, 100 years ahead of time. Melquiades had written them in Sanskrit, which was his mother tongue, and he'd encoded the even lines in the private cipher of the Emperor Augustus and the odd ones in the Lacedaemonian military code. The final protection was based on the fact that Melquiades had not put events in the order of man's conventional time, but had concentrated a century of daily episodes in such a way that they coexisted in one instant. Then the wind began, warm, incipient, full of voices from the past, the murmurs of ancient geraniums, sighs of disenchantment that preceded the most tenacious nostalgia. Aureliano pursued the hidden paths, and he was so absorbed that he did not feel the second surge of wind, either as its cyclonic strength tore the doors and windows off their hinges and pulled off the roof of the east wing and uprooted the foundations. Macondo was already a fearful whirlwind of dust and rubble, being spun about by the wrath of the biblical hurricane. When Aureliano skipped 11 pages so as not to lose time, with facts he knew only too well, and he began to decipher the instant he was living, deciphering it as he lived it, prophesying himself in the act of deciphering the last page of the parchments, as if he were looking into a speaking mirror. Then he skipped again to anticipate the predictions and ascertain the date and circumstances of his death. Before reaching the final line, however, he'd already understood that he would never leave that room, for it was foreseen that the city of mirrors or mirages would be wiped out by the wind and exiled from the memory of men at the precise moment when Aureliano Babilonia would finish deciphering the parchments, and that everything written on them was unrepeatable, since time immemorial and forevermore, because lineages condemned to 100 years of solitude did not have a second opportunity on earth. But as in many Latin American rhythms of life, there's duality and oscillation, because in his Nobel Prize lecture, Garcia Marquez at the end returns to this very moment, to the fate of people who suffer 100 years, or is it 1,000 years of solitude, and speaks of hope and more opportunities on earth. In a way, his second conclusion resonates with the passage read by Maria Cristina, the passage about La Virgen de Guadalupe, that brown, trilingual Virgin Mary, that mestiza mother who revealed herself to the Aztec Christian catechist Juan Diego at a place known as the Hill of the Edge. She tells him and us that her compassion, that the cloak of her love which she offered was offered to all the different peoples who call out their stories, their miseries, and their hopes. To all the different peoples, I hope you will join me and the many others who not only seek to understand this mystery and the potentials of the borderlands, but who also seek to share it with the peoples all over who are struggling with their own biblical hurricanes. Thank you for your attention.
It's now my happy duty to conclude this convocation, this 191st convocation, and it's very hard to do so with any words after David's eloquence. But let me say that I hope that we all may go forth into a new academic year, into a new academic term, with some renewed sense of dedication of ourselves, and indeed of ourselves not only to our own work, but to the community in which we work, and to the recognition that the kind of borderlands, the discovery of the kind of borderlands that David has been talking about, and of our pilgrim nature in them, to take up Harvey's metaphor from the beginning, is, I think, a very important and good way to think about our work, our academic work, and perhaps our work in our own personal faiths, whatever those may be. So let us go forth, I hope, with renewed vigor out of this inspiring set of words this afternoon. Please, I remind you, join us under the tent over on Francis Avenue for refreshments and fellowship with others who are caught in these academic borderlands. Good evening.